Hello, my name is Allison, and today I will be discussing my topic, which is blood. As we go through this topic, keep this image in your mind. These are red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, and we will be discussing their physical shape and anatomy later on. Starting off, we will discuss blood and its elements. Blood is made up of what are called formed elements. These are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. It is important to note that blood is a connective tissue and is fluid due to the extracellular matrix of plasma, which we will discuss in more detail later on in the presentation. Blood has a few unique characteristics that we will discuss next. The average temperature of blood is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, although this can vary. The average pH of blood is about 7.4, although this one can vary a bit as well. Blood makes up roughly 8% of an adult's body weight, and plasma, which we briefly mentioned before, is about 92% water. Next, we will go into more detail on what plasma is composed of. Plasma, as I mentioned, is roughly 92% water. It is also about 7% proteins. The proteins in the plasma are albuminal, which is a binding transport protein for hormones. It's also the highest concentrated protein within the plasma. Then there are globulins, which are the second most common proteins in plasma, and they have transport and immunity functions as well. Lastly is the fibrinogen, which is the smallest amount of protein found in the plasma. It is produced by the liver, and it has very important functions when it comes to platelets and blood clotting. We will be discussing that one a little more in depth towards the end here. As you may recall, erythrocytes are red blood cells. That was that first slide I had pulled up with the discs. Recall those as we go through what erythrocytes and red blood cells are. Next up is the life cycle of erythrocytes. This life cycle is composed of three main stages. The stages are production, maturity, and destruction. Production is also called erythropoiesis and is completed within the red bone marrow, and that's what this picture is right here. This is a microscopic view of red bone marrow. Mature red blood cells travel throughout the body, and they typically live for about 100 to 125 days each. The destruction stage is the final stage and is called euryptosis. The spleen actually helps to control the balance of the production and destruction and to maintain the proper amount of red blood cells within the body. There are a couple disorders related to red blood cells. I would like to mention one is anemia. This is caused by having a deficiency of red blood cells. Red blood cells have a fairly basic anatomy. They are bioconcave cells, meaning that they are oval-shaped with a concave section in the middle, like that first picture I showed. And they are filled with hemoglobin, which we will discuss up next. Now we will discuss hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is made up of proteins and iron. The proteins, known as globins, are folded chains of proteins. Each of these chains are bound to a heme. A heme is a red-colored molecule with iron in it. Hemoglobin's function is to bind with and transport oxygen molecules throughout the body. Next on our list is platelets. Platelets are not actual cells themselves, which is why they are not considered formed elements. Platelets are fragments of megakaryocytes that are surrounded by a plasma membrane. Once the platelets have formed, about a third of them travel to the spleen to be stored for future use if needed. And most platelets only live for about 10 days before they are destroyed. When platelets are needed, they are incredibly useful and powerful. They are the key player in a process called hemostasis. This is the three-step process by which the body goes through to prevent blood loss. The three steps are vascular spasm, formation of the platelet plug, and coagulation. In the first step, vascular spasm, the muscles in the walls of the blood vessel contract. This interferes with the smooth flow of blood and decreases the blood flow. In the second step, with the forming the platelet plug, the free-flowing platelets come to the spot where the blood vessel is injured or damaged, and then they begin to clump together. This process, aided by a glycoprotein, creates a sort of plug on the injury to slow the blood loss as well. The last step in this process is coagulation. This is how a blood clot is formed. The clot is made up of fibrin, which we mentioned before, and traps platelets and blood cells within it. This also helps to slow the loss of blood for the injury. Lastly, I will be discussing the coagulation pathways. The faster pathway is this first one I have listed here, the extrinsic pathway. This one starts about as soon as the traumatic injury occurs. Once the injury occurs, the extravascular cells that are extrinsic to the bloodstream, meaning outside of the bloodstream, begin to release thromboplastin, which sets off a chain reaction of enzymes and proteins being released that leads to the coagulation. The second pathway is the intrinsic pathway, which is much slower compared to the first one. This process involves the internal workings of the bloodstream. This reaction normally occurs when the bloodstream comes into contact with a foreign substance or object. It is also often found that this path tries to occur when there are some blood tests being done. When chemicals are mixed with the blood, they assume that it is a foreign substance, and they try to coagulate this way. While the intrinsic pathway process takes a few minutes, the extrinsic pathway process only takes a few seconds. Once one of those pathways is finished, they both lead to the common pathway. That's the third one down here at the bottom. This is where the fibrin produces and seals off the affected blood vessel. Once this has been done, prothrombinase is converted to thrombin, which then converts to fibrinogen, which we mentioned before being incredibly important when it comes to blood clotting. The fibrinogen is then converted to fibrin strands that help stabilize the clot. And the last thing I want to mention is anticoagulants. This is something that hinders coagulation. Within the body, there are multiple types of anticoagulants that are naturally occurring, and they prevent the blood from clotting when it shouldn't. Antithrombin is an enzyme that does this in the common pathway. Another shorter acting anticoagulant is heparin. Heparin is one that is found in the surfaces of some cells. There is also a version of heparin that is given to treat patients who are at risk of blood clots. Lastly, here are my sources.